right, Zabel, what do you think? Should we get things kicked off here?
Yeah, let's do this. Okay. So hi everyone, I'm Zabel. I'm the product manager for Gage and Taiko. And you've signed up for the webinar user journey testing with Gage and Taiko. And thank you everyone for taking the time off to be here. And I'm very excited to have Scott over here talk about user journey testing with Gage and Taiko. As you know, we are quite passionate about testing, and we believe after this webinar, you're going to have an idea of what Gage and Taiko has to offer and how it's going to make testing easy for you. And we have a short agenda for this webinar where Scott is going to introduce the tools, talk about user journey testing, and as he's already mentioned, there's a Q&A button on your screen. If you have questions, please use this to ask them, and we'll try to answer all the questions during the webinar. But if you're not able to do it during the session, we'll answer them after the webinar. Over to Scott.
Wonderful. I'm busy typing an answer to a question rather than running the webinar. So as Zabel said, I am so happy to have Zabel here. He is the lead of this project, and so it's nice having someone who actually knows what he's talking about here joining us. My name is Scott Davis, though. I'm a web architect and developer advocate with ThoughtWorks. And many times people say web architect. What does that actually mean? And when we're talking about web apps, certainly I think web it's important that we deal with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. That's kind of non-negotiable. That's a key value of what we need to deal with. But when we're talking about web apps, it's helpful to think of them in terms of accessibility and performance and privacy and security. And so as a web architect, I like taking a holistic approach and dealing with all of those issues. And sometimes people get cheeky and say, well, where's the T in web apps? How come testing isn't called out? And it's because I really feel that testing isn't a role, it's a skill. And it's absolutely part and parcel to what we all are responsible for as web developers. So I'm very much a web developer. I'm very much a hands-on web developer. I feel passionately that an architect who doesn't code is like a chef who doesn't eat. And so I'm excited to take you through this idea of user journey testing, introduce you to a couple of tools that I'm quite excited about myself. But these are tools that I'm not just talking about, but I use hands-on on a day-to-day basis in my role as a web architect. So that said, please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. As we mentioned earlier, that if these are timely messages, timely questions, we will address them certainly in the middle of the presentation. But don't be worried if you've asked a question and it doesn't get answered right away. That might be something we're reserving to the end, and we have quite a bit of time reserved at the end for questions and answers. So let's dive in, shall we? We're here to talk about Gage and Taiko. And so if you want to take a look at Gage, we're certainly going to be hands-on and demonstrating this. But if you go to gage.org, this is where you'll find documentation and installation instructions for this test runner. And it's a test runner that's specifically focused on acceptance testing, or as you might imagine, what I like calling user journey testing. But we will dive into that in greater detail in just a moment. This is only one tool that we're going to be focusing on. The other tool is Taiko. And as the URL suggests, if you go to taiko.gage.org, what you're going to end up with here is a browser automation tool. Now, this is where the confusion sets in. Let me address one of the biggest questions I get asked right out of the gate here, that these are in fact two separate tools, but we're going to be talking about how to use them together, because I really feel that 1 + 1 = 3 in this situation. If we have Gage, which is a test runner that really makes it easy to express our tests in the language of the user, this is why I like calling them user journey tests. And then we have a tool like Taiko, which is a browser automation tool, something that allows us to programmatically open browsers and go to URLs and click on buttons and fill in fields. I feel that these two technologies, when used together, really, as I said, are a multiplier. The sum is much greater than the parts individually. So this idea of user journey testing is certainly not new. It's been around for quite some time. What I like most about user journey testing is not only are we going to simulate a typical user's journey through a website, we're going to visit URLs and click on buttons exactly like a user would, but my favorite aspect of user journey testing is that it brings user to the forefront. Acceptance testing certainly implies the existence of users, but by calling these, in fact, user journey tests, we're bringing users in terms of language, in terms of awareness to the forefront. And this is crucial because I come to you as a developer, and I know many times if you ask a developer, what's the step one of a new project, they'll certainly say, oh, well, we need to download a framework, or we need to set up a GitHub repo, or we need to set up our CI/CD infrastructure. And if you're a fan of design thinking, in fact, step one in the process is empathy, is thinking like a user, is imagining how the user is going to end up using your website. And so this idea of empathy being step one, of bringing users to the forefront of the conversation, is not something that is I'm going to mention now and leave behind. This is something that you're going to find is intrinsic and based in to this idea of user journey testing. And you'll find that ThoughtWorks, in fact, has a long history of being user-focused in its tests. Back in 2003, a thought worker named Dan North began talking about this idea of BDD, or behavior-driven development. And he's very non-apologetic about this at all. He says that I am a developer first, and I love the idea of TDD, or test-driven development. But in fact, TDD is a developer-focused endeavor. We end up writing tests in the language of the developer, and we end up addressing the needs of the developer. We end up writing tests that assert not null, or assert an exception doesn't get thrown, or these kinds of things. And so the idea of behavior-driven development is taking the spirit of TDD, but again, reversing the intent, or reversing the core demographic, and focusing on the user experience rather than the developer experience, UX versus DX. Now, back in 2003, he created a framework called JBehave. Later in 2007, he, of course, ported this to Ruby, and it became RBehave. And later that year, it became integrated with RSpec. And if you've done any Ruby development at all, these names should be very familiar with you. But even outside of the Ruby realm, another thought worker named Aslak Helisoy created a BDD tool called Cucumber. And I'm a big fan of Cucumber. It's a plain text way of expressing the needs of our users. It's a DSL, if you will, a domain-specific language, and he created a parser called Gherkin to go along with it. Now, Gauge is not Cucumber. I want to be very clear about this, but it's important that we understand the history of ThoughtWorks' involvement in these user journey type tests to make sure we can really appreciate what Gauge offers us. But it's very much in the spirit of Cucumber, in that this is plain text that we're expressing these things in, and we can see that we're not asserting nulls and asserting array lengths and things along those lines. We are certainly expressing these tests in the language of the user. Eric wants to withdraw money from his bank account. Given he has a valid credit card, when he inserts his card, then the ATM should return his money. And these keywords, this given, when, then rubric is really the secret sauce of Cucumber, because Cucumber can in fact be implemented in Ruby using RSpec, or Java using JBehave, or a number of different testing libraries. But we're expressing our tests in the language of the user. Now, that said, Cucumber is a bit like writing haiku. In that haiku poems have very specific rules associated with them. They must be 3 lines. They must have a specific number of syllables in each line. And so nothing to take away from haiku or Cucumber. A on the downside of something like this with light but strict rules is I found people bend Cucumber and try to get Cucumber to write tests that in fact don't really reflect the spirit or the intent of Cucumber. So when we look at Gauge, in fact, what we've done is rather than using a custom DSL like Cucumber that requires a custom parser like Gherkin, we are in fact expressing our tests in Markdown, which means we can use Markdown parsers for this, but it also really frees up the language to be as expressive as we want without this given, when, then set of requirements. So you'll see we'll be writing specifications here. Our specification here is counting vowels, and we want to count vowels in a number of different ways, and so we have a number of scenarios involved in counting vowels. So we see a hash or an H1 defines our specification. A double hash or an H2 in web speak defines our individual scenarios, and the asterisk in fact is a list of steps we take to satisfy these scenarios. So in one case we have steps like where we just kind of enumerate the vowels in the English language. Vowels in the English language are A, E, I, O, U. We have another table that allows us to walk through a number of different words and count the vowels inside. So this is Gauge in a nutshell right here. It is a test runner that your tests, your specifications are expressed in Markdown, but most importantly, they're expressed in the language of the user. Now, just like Cucumber, we need to have languages backing these specifications, languages backing these scenarios to do the individual steps. Now, Taiko is implemented in JavaScript, so that's what I'm going to be focusing on here today. But do realize that Gauge can be, your specifications, your scenarios can be implemented in a polyglot manner. Your specifications can be implemented in C# or Java or Python or Ruby. And what's powerful about this polyglot approach to testing is many times, especially when people are dealing with Selenium, they say, well, I love the power of Selenium, but this is a Ruby product. And so all of a sudden, excuse me, we have two languages in our project, one the language of the app and the other the language of our tests. This can be a drawback, or in fact, it could be quite powerful. We could be writing our application in C#, but we find that we want the expressiveness of Python to do the testing. So a tool like Gauge and its polyglot nature gives us the ability to not only express our scenarios and our specifications in the language of the user, but we also get some flexibility in the underlying language in which we are going to implement these tests. But the beauty of Gauge right here is we can begin seeing that we have these steps, a step like vowels in the English language are. And so the way we match our scenarios and our steps to the underlying language is by simple pattern matching. Vowels in the English language are, vowels in the English language are. And we can see when we wrap something in quotes, this ends up being a variable that we can pass in to our step. When we're dealing with something like tables, we can iterate through each row in this table and do our assertions on each row as we move along. So what we have is a very simple but expressive set of scenarios in Markdown, and then we have a simple way to tie those scenarios to, in fact, the underlying implementation in the language of our choice. Now, none of this would be worthwhile at all if we didn't have pretty reports to deal with at the end of these. When we use Gauge and Taiko in our CI/CD environment, these reports are often our proof to let us know that our specifications passed and the timing that each one of these specifications took. Since we're dealing with live browsers, sometimes performance becomes a real interesting aspect of these tests beyond the simple assertions of pass, fail. So when we couple the expressiveness of scenarios and specifications in Markdown with the polyglot language of your choice to implement these tests and good-looking reports that let us know what pass and fail and also the timing of these individual things, we begin seeing the real value proposition of Gauge. This takes nothing away from Cucumber and Gherkin, but in fact, I think that this is a very modern expression of the intent with a set of interesting features to go along with it. Now, if you want to install Gauge, I already have things installed. And if you want to do this yourself, you can. Of course, these are right up here on gauge.org. It won't be hard to find these after the webinar as well. We've just recently rewritten the documentation site on Gauge, and I think the folks that worked on this did an outstanding job because we get to kind of choose our own adventure here. I happen to be on a Mac, so I've chosen Mac. I'm a JavaScript fan, yes, unapologetically. Unironically, I love JavaScript. That's a language I find quite expressive. So I've chosen to express my tests in JavaScript. And then we've got great IDE support in here as well through Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio or IntelliJ. So as you select your various options along here, you'll get customized installation instructions on how to install Gauge and how to install the IDE support for the IDE of your choice. Once Gauge is installed, we need to actually spin up a new project. Now, we have projects in our IDEs, and I promise you I will be dealing with IDE support because it is quite nice. But if I come in just briefly here, and I just wanted to show you that I've got a blank directory I'm going to create. I am in Denver right now, so why don't I go ahead and make a Denver directory. Again, I wanted to prove to you nothing up my sleeve here at all. In terms of getting started, I can initiate a new Gauge project and then specify the language that I am interested in using for that project. Since I'm interested in JavaScript, I'm going to do a Gauge init.js. And what we'll find is this is going to template out this directory for us. It's going to download the language support that we need. We don't need to watch this in its entirety, but this is definitely something that can happen in seconds, not minutes or hours. Downloading Chromium, this is a feature of Taiko right here, and we'll definitely talk more about how Chromium and Taiko complement each other. I was hoping that I would have talked long enough for this installation process to be complete. Clearly, there we go. All I had to do is call it out right there. So in that amount of time, we now have a new Gauge project ready to get up and running. The third thing we'll want to do is actually run it. And of course, you can run it from your IDE, but if you just type in a simple Gauge run, you'll see that out of the box, we have tests that will turn around, open up a new web browser. There we go. Do a specific search on a key value like Taiko and get our results back. So let me turn around and re-emphasize what we just saw here. Once you have Gauge up and running, it is that easy to create a new Gauge project, Gauge init the language you'd like, and you have tests already available to you. If we wanted to look at them briefly, and I mean briefly because we will certainly come in right now and customize these, we see that getting started with Gauge, we have a scenario that allows us to search the Taiko repository. And we're able to go to the Get Gauge GitHub page. We're able to search for Taiko and assert that that page contains those values. This is the markdown I was talking about. These are the steps we took to search that Taiko repository. That was our scenario right there. And if we turn around now and look at the implementations we took to get there, of course, we have Taiko featured prominently in here. Before we run every one of our suites, we're going to open a browser. After our suite, we're going to close it down. And then we see the steps being matched up to the markdown through that simple string matching. What I love most about this is mostly JavaScript. This is modern ECMAScript JavaScript right here. We'll see that Taiko, everything in Taiko is asynchronous, so we can banish those nasty sleep statements wherever they exist, and we can make sure that we get the fastest possible set of tests that we can. Now, we'll come back and revisit those specifications, of course, but you can create a project within your IDE, and you can certainly run your project within your IDE as well. So one question that came up right now is that how do we use Gauge in collaboration with a team of testers? How should each one of us use Gauge so all of our test specs get saved in a common repository? This is a very good question, and thank you for asking it, because in fact, normally when I'm doing unit testing or TDD, I like storing those tests in the project. I like storing those tests as close to the application as possible. When it comes to Gauge, you'll see I did just the opposite. I like creating a separate project because in fact we'll be running Gauge against dev, and we'll be running it against prod, and we'll be running it against staging and all kinds of different environments. So I feel the best way to share Gauge and share these specifications among your team members is to in fact create a separate repository and have everyone join that. See, I told you you could ask questions. I told you we'd even answer them. So thank you so much for asking. So as we get back in, Gauge is only half of the story. Now, again, we could end the presentation right now, and please, that was rhetorical. We're not going to end the presentation right now. But Taiko now is the second aspect of what we're trying to deal with. If Gauge was giving us our user journey tests in the language of the user in Markdown, Taiko is now how we begin automating the browser, driving the browser as you would. This is the second bit of secret sauce. Installing it couldn't be easier. npm install Taiko globally. Of course, you can install Taiko locally with your projects. We saw that when I did a Gauge init.js. In fact, we got a local version of Taiko as well. But I like installing Taiko globally because I use this independently of Gauge all the time. And just like ThoughtWorks had over a 15-year history of dealing with user-centric testing, we also have over 15 years of automated browser driving as well. You've almost certainly heard of Selenium. That was a ThoughtWorks project created by Jason Huggins back in 2004. Selenium has gone through a number of different iterations, remote control and Selenium 2, but a key value again around 2007, another thought worker named Simon Stewart develops an automation tool called WebDriver. That in fact now is a W3C spec that is getting implemented across all modern browsers. But in 2009, we took the best of Selenium and we took the best of WebDriver, combined these two projects and named them Selenium 2.0. Once again, I am a big fan of Selenium and WebDriver. The power of being able to remotely drive your browsers. This browser over there in the corner, I want you to open up this browser and visit a URL and click on links and click on buttons as we move along. This is incredibly powerful. But the reality is, and this is through no fault of Selenium at all, is that your Selenium tests can be flaky. Even though I can't see you, I know many of you are nodding your head knowingly right now. I've felt this pain myself. The joy of Selenium is when it works, but when we're dealing with actual browsers, actual evergreen browsers that update out from under you, if a browser gets out of sync with WebDriver, then you can have false failures. Your tests can fail in very unglamorous ways. These Selenium tests can also be fairly flaky because of the selectors. If you went in and wrote very highly specific selectors, I want to select this IDE or this class or this very nested way of getting to these elements, you find that that is flaky as well, because as we change new class names, as we change the structure of our page, in fact, that's not the intent of what we're trying to test, but our tests break nonetheless. So with something like Taiko, we've addressed this idea of flaky tests by actually including the browser with Taiko. And I know it sounds simple after the fact, but I can't tell you how revolutionary this is. Every time you install Taiko, you get a known, working, good browser installed with it. Now it installs Chromium, which represents about 2/3 of the market right now. Obviously, Google Chrome is the most opposite, and this is cute, right? Chromium, the element, is how we make the metal Chrome, and so in fact, Chromium, the software project, is how Google makes Chrome, the web browser. Clever bunch, aren't they? But Microsoft Edge is now using Chromium under the hood. So now we have tests that include both Google Chrome and Microsoft Edge. Opera also uses Chromium. So in fact, what we have is a known good browser that represents well over 2/3 of the market right now. This is pretty good coverage. Now we are tied specifically to Chrome and Chromium more specifically because Taiko uses the Chrome DevTools protocol. This in fact is the same protocol that your Chrome developer tools use. So anytime you pull up the web inspector and you're dealing with this, you are in fact pulling up a separate app that is using the CDP, the Chrome DevTools protocol, to talk to that browser. We are using that same pipeline. So anything that you can do in Chrome DevTools, you can do in Taiko as well. I told you early on that I'm a big fan of testing for accessibility, for performance, for SEO. And if you've never run a Lighthouse report, this in fact is a separate application as well. If you're in your Chrome developer tools, look for the audit tab and you should see Lighthouse right there. And you could run audit tests for accessibility, performance, SEO, PWA, progressive web app readiness, all number of things through the Chrome DevTools protocol. But as much as I love running Lighthouse in browser, I love running it out of browser in my CI/CD pipeline even more. You can npm install Lighthouse, and it will run over the CDP to do all this testing as a part of your CI/CD pipeline. And just like you can npm install Lighthouse or npm install Puppeteer, another project that's very similar to Taiko from Google, we npm Taiko and get the same benefits of all of these. These are really, it's hard for me to think of these as competitors. Anything I can do in Chrome DevTools, I can do in Taiko. Anything I can do in Puppeteer, I can do in Taiko. So if I find Stack Overflow answers, or I find blog entries on the web that are using one of these tools, I know that I can very quickly port those to Taiko. And it is a porting because Puppeteer is incredibly powerful, but I find the API to be very terse as well. There are a lot of sharp, pointy edges on that. Taiko can do everything Puppeteer can do, but it does it in a very nice, high-level, friendly DSL domain-specific language. But I lose none of the ability to drill down and get down into the nitty-gritty like Puppeteer. So Taiko is a lovely, high-level DSL that is also sharp as a scalpel and allows me to get as detailed as I would need to be. So one of my other favorite features of Taiko, I have so many favorite features of Taiko, but one of my other favorite features of Taiko is the REPL, being able to use it interactively. So let's come in here right now and do this now. If I type in Taiko, we'll find that I am actually in my REPL, in the modern version of the REPL right here. The first thing I'm going to want to do is open a browser. And in fact, what we'll see happen here is Chromium fire up. I have a nice new blank browser available to me. Now, what's really nice about this is I can immediately go to any website I would like. This is no different than me actually going up to that address line and typing in by hand. Now, I want to search on something in here. So in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on search. And we find through that red highlighting that we are now in that search box. This selector logic that we found here, you can see I didn't specify an ID or a class name. I still have that ability to do that. We'll see examples of that. But I can also begin expressing my tests in the language of the user rather than the language of the developer, which is IDs and classes and deep complex selector logic. If I want to go ahead and enter something in fact, what I will do is I will enter Selenium software, just as a user would end up typing. There we go. It's not enter, of course, it's write, but you can see I typed in .api, and this pulls up a list of everything I can possibly type in. And if I want to learn more about it, I can certainly type in API, and we're going to be writing. So let me read up a little bit more on write. Clearly, I needed a little refresher here. I can simply write admin, or in my case, I'm going to write Selenium software, because I know that in fact is the magic search term that I'm looking for in there. And we can see I'm writing it in. And then if I want to do something like press enter, I will give you 3 guesses as to what we would do here. In fact, I would press enter. And we're now on this page within Wikipedia. If I see history in the table of contents right here, I can simply click history. And now I'm on the history setting. So all this is what I love, love, love about Taiko, having this interactive REPL. Now, what's nice is all this code I've been typing in, if I type in .code, in fact, we can see that all these steps I've been doing have been captured. So I can dump them immediately as, oh, I don't know, a wikitest.js, but oh, wait. If I wanted to capture my steps so I could immediately insert them into Gauge, I can do that as well. So I can come in here and I can say step wiki steps.js, and now I have something that is ready to be included in Gauge. Isn't that something? So this self-learning, this self-documenting way of dealing with Taiko is as simple as getting into the REPL, typing in .api to learn about what your browser actions are. And this high-level DSL, open browser, close browser, open tab, close tab, go to, click, double click, right click. These all do exactly what you would expect them to do. All this is well documented, of course, on taiko.gauge.org as well, but this gives us an opportunity to come in and do some on-the-fly learning. And when you do this on-the-fly learning, being able to save it out immediately. When I typed in .code, this would allow me to run it in Taiko without running it inside of Gauge. But when I typed in .step, it allowed me to drop it immediately into Gauge. So we can see I have a number of ways I can open up a browser. One of the things I like doing is changing the size. The other thing I really like doing is an emulate device. So I can emulate an iPhone 10, or I can emulate a Pixel 3, or I can emulate specific devices in here as well. We even see the magic incantations we need to run something like Taiko inside of a Docker container. Now, what's quite lovely about these arguments is these, in fact, not Taiko arguments. These are Chromium arguments. So whatever knowledge you bring with you to Chromium, you can apply immediately. Whatever knowledge you don't have about Chromium is not tied up within Taiko. What you learn in this process is more broadly applicable to Chromium in general, rather than bringing you down a very specific path with a very specific knowledge base. So in terms of demoing this, I've put together a live website called ConferenceWorks. It's a very real website for a very fake software conference. Again, thirstyhead.com/conferenceworks. And I have created a corresponding set of Gauge and Taiko tests. These can be found on github.com/thirstyhead/conferenceworks-tests. But let me bring this up for just a moment so you can begin seeing what it's like to actually run these. So I'm going to bring these up in VS Code. It's quite a nice little IDE. When it actually launches, there we go. All right. So here we'll see a number of specs that I have in my step implementations. If I wanted to do something simple like, oh, I don't know, just go to the ConferenceWorks homepage and search for Welcome to ConferenceWorks. These are our individual steps. And if I come down and look at my steps to get there, we can see, in fact, that I can go to the ConferenceWorks homepage. We were using to actually match up with that step. So once again, go to ConferenceWorks homepage, go to the ConferenceWorks homepage right here. But in this spirit of trying to capture the plain English intent, later on in my tests, I'm saying, I'm just going to shortcut this and say, go to ConferenceWorks. And so this is a simple JavaScript array. Anything that uses any one of these phrases will simply go to the ConferenceWorks URL that we define up top. Now, if I want to search for a specific string in here, we can say search for a various text string, and I can make sure that I can await for that test to appear and then assert OK. What's quite nice about Taiko here is that I'm not tied to any one testing framework as well. So if you're already using Jest and you like the assertions of Jest, please continue to use Jest with Taiko. If you like Mocha and Chai, if you're in an Angular shop, please continue to use Mocha and Chai as your assertion library. I'm using the simple npm node-based assert library to get things done here. But now that I'm in my IDE, we can see I can come in here very quickly and run my scenario directly from my IDE. So this is going to hop out right now. It's going to visit ThoughtWorks on the web. And I can see down below here in my status bar that 1 executed, 1 passed, 0 failed, 0 skipped. But if I click in here, here are these reports where I can see the individual steps. Now, of course, if I wanted to run the whole suite, there is nothing stopping me from coming out to a terminal. As you can tell, I enjoy my time at the terminal in VI. I like my time at the terminal because my CI/CD pipeline also likes spending its time at the terminal. But if I were to do something like gauge run, in fact, we would be running all the specs 1 through 5, and we would be able to get a report showing us all the tests as we move through here. Speakers and clicking through individual speakers and schedules. As I'm going to show you, we can even begin mocking out our calls to microservices. We can do all manner of fun things within Taiko. We've got some form validation going on in here, so I'll bring up some form validation examples as well so we can see what's going on. But this should be the last test. And so as we type in Susie Q and get through the last of our required fields here, we should have a successful report. Quite a run. Our user journey test did exactly what it said it was going to do. It actually ran through the entirety of my website. And so we can begin seeing things like, hey, I visited this URL and made sure we had a specific element in play. We can see that I went to the home page and looked for individual speakers, but I also have some table ways of going through. So as I visit these individual pages, I can search for these individual values. As I search for individual speakers, as I drill in, we can see I can search for their last name. I'm going to show you the test implementations here, but this is how we can even write out comments to Gauge to include with our report output. When it comes to tables, wow, I can begin mocking out actual microservices here right in Taiko. And when it comes to forms, I can get very detailed that as I make sure that required is next to my first name field, and I can make sure that this is invalid in the browser sense of the word. As I click on labels and begin filling them in, I can ensure that my fields are valid. So anything I would normally do as a user, I can now express in code. So I do want to save time for questions. We do have a lot of questions that are popping up. Please do continue to ask them. But let me show you just a couple of the highlights here, and then we can get into the open Q&A session. I mentioned that Gauge gives us the ability to do table-based scenarios. This makes it very easily for us to grind through all these speaker pages or grind through all the pages in our website. And so if I have something visit and search with a table after it, I would expect to find a visit and search that has a table inside of it. Now, I learned the hard way, don't ask how I learned this, that in fact, for each, the JavaScript, the ECMAScript version doesn't support asynchronous calls, and everything in Taiko is asynchronous. But this for of works perfectly. And so as I have this table passed in, I'm going to walk through each row in that table. I'm going to pull out page and search. Once again, page and search are my columns. And so I can pull out page and search here. I can send a message to Gauge saying, hey, I'm about to visit this page. And we can see these are ECMAScript template strings. I can asynchronously go to this URL, and only once that go to is completed successfully will I turn around and assert that the text I'm looking for is in fact on this page. No more sleeps. This runs as fast as your web server can serve up those pages. So mocking out content, or excuse me, dealing with tabular content is incredibly powerful. It allows you to do quite a bit in a very concise and I feel readable set of scenarios. If I wanted to run this individual scenario, of course, I could click here and run it. And some people love them, some debugging. So of course I could turn around and debug with breakpoints and everything else. Debugging doesn't actually remove the bugs. It just allows you to experience the bugs in slow motion, of course, right? When I'm dealing with this table, coming along here, I can make a real call to this, but I can also begin mocking these out. This is absolutely one of my favorite features. I need to find a new way of expressing my love for Taiko. Everything is a favorite feature, just like every story is a top priority. But when I want to begin mocking out this microservice, we can find that instead of the actual JSON that would come down from the network call, I can actually capture this inline right in my test. And then in Taiko, I can intercept what would be my normal call to this microservice, and then replace the body with this mock JSON here. So all of a sudden now in this test, without having to set up a whole new set of test servers and everything else, don't get me wrong, I love me some Mountebank. Mountebank is another testing product written by a great thought worker. If you wanted to have something more sophisticated, I couldn't recommend Mountebank more highly, but boy, I sure like the simple elegance of mocking out my microservices and intercepting them inline in my tests. So once I have mocked out that microservice, I can turn around and go to the schedule. And this time I will see Fun with Cheese rather than Dr. Rebecca Parsons' keynote in its place. The last thing I want to leave you with, and then I do want to leave time for open questions and answers here, although we've been answering a ton of questions in line. So please continue to ask your questions. But this registration form, this is where we really get into the nitty-gritty, and people always are skeptical of high-level friendly DSLs. By people, I mean me, of course. And this is what really sold me on Taiko. Some of these more advanced features, being able to inline mock out AJAX calls, and now being able to come in and not only do simple things like click on fields, but verifying that these values are in place and doing a deep dive into the app itself, into the DOM itself. So as we come along here and look at this, we begin seeing that in order to verify that a field is valid or verify that a field is invalid, keep in mind that I'm in Node.js. I am outside of the browser right now. But by evaluate, I am absolutely able to stream in. This is in fact through WebSockets. This is through the Chrome DevTools protocol. I'm actually able to stream into that live app in browser and in fact select this field name, get the element, and make sure the CSS is in fact valid or invalid. So being able to not only run these in our CI/CD pipeline as kind of an impartial third party, but also being able to evaluate this in the context of the live browser that I'm touching really gives us this taste of how simple it is to get started with Taiko and how easy it is to take Taiko all the way to the finish line. So I do encourage you to go and check out these tests. You should be able to clone these and run them right out of the box, assuming that you have Gauge installed and Taiko installed on your system as well. These will be beating against a live web server, but again, realize this is a live website for a fake conference, so please beat on it mercilessly. Of course, the source code is up on Thirsty Head as well, so if you wanted to download the source code itself and find it, you're more than welcome to do that. But to wrap up here, and this is where we're going to give you a poll in just a moment, give you some simple questions, but also open this up to more free-form questions. But we have now seen Gauge in action. And Gauge is in fact a test runner that makes it incredibly easy to express your tests in the language of the user. We call them user journey tests because step one is empathy, and being able to express our tests in the language of the user brings us closer to, in fact, experiencing the user journey ourselves. And Taiko is a browser automation tool. Both of these are standing on the shoulders of giants, standing on 15 years of experience with friendly user-based testing, user-focused testing, user-centric testing, and browser automation. I feel that Selenium and WebDriver really established the state of the art for nearly 2 decades now. But what Taiko brings to us is all of the benefits of Selenium and WebDriver, but the stability of including the web browser with the web runner. That is worth the price of admission right there. And as you saw, the freedom and the flexibility of these selectors, you can absolutely drill in, as we were doing, to select individual elements or individual classes or individual IDs. You can get as specific as you want. But in fact, the more specific you get with your selectors, the more fragile your tests become. Because as your CSS classes change out from under you, as your HTML structure changes out from under you, your tests become brittle and break. So the selector logic of Taiko allows my user journey test to be resilient, not only across individual changes to elements and classes. I think it's not hard to imagine how Taiko tests could survive whole-scale framework shifts as well. I could have a series of tests written in Taiko against a React-based website, and if I chose to strip React out and go to a plain, vanilla, browser-native HTML, CSS, and JavaScript-based implementation, my tests can be resilient and survive those changes. So while Gauge is a strong tool on its own and Taiko is a strong tool on its own, together 1 + 1 truly equals 3. We begin dealing with 2 different frameworks, 2 different libraries, 2 different bits of executable code that are quite strong on their own, but are especially strong when used together. And that, my friends, is user journeying with Gauge and Taiko. I sure hope you enjoyed yourself. I'm going to turn things back over to Zabel right now, but we're going to give you a quick poll. It's going to pop up in the middle of your screen, so I don't want you to freak out when that happens. But you've also been doing a great job of asking questions. Take this opportunity to answer the poll questions and add additional Q&As, and let's open up this last 10 minutes or so to an open Q&A session. Zabel, can I hand things over to you?